Hi, everyone, and welcome. We'll start in just a moment after we see the room fill up. Okay, welcome all. We are so pleased to have so many civic infrastructure enthusiasts join us for today's program. I'm Kelly Hummerkhauser, Director of Government Relations at Main Street America. As we begin, I want to offer a few of those standard logistical reminders for everyone who's joining us. We welcome and encourage your questions throughout today's program. We highly encourage you to use the Q&A function on your control panel. The chat is open, but if you use the Q&A function, we will be able to more easily address your question. We are recording this program, and we intend to post it on Main Street America's YouTube page following the program. We will send a follow-up to let you know when that's available. And as is a tradition with some of our Main Street America hosted webinars, we welcome you to use the chat function to let us know where you're joining us from today. It's always nice to see where our attendees come from throughout the country. For those of you who don't know us, Main Street America is a national nonprofit organization. We lead a collaborative movement with partners and grassroots organizations that advances shared prosperity, creates resilient economies, and improves quality of life by strengthening downtowns and neighborhood commercial corridors across the country. Civic infrastructure is an important element of that work, helping us to create authentic places where people can come together for a shared purpose and find a sense of belonging. 3 years ago, as talks were underway for infrastructure legislation, Main Street America joined a group of other local, state, and national organizations through the Percent for Place Coalition. Percent for Place specific goal has been to see a small percentage of federal funding dedicated to the physical civic infrastructure of our communities. Those places like parks, playgrounds, main streets, and trails where people come together. Investments in civic infrastructure are shown to reduce social isolation and create economic mobility. I want to share my deep thanks to Bridget Marquis, the Director of Reimagining the Civic Commons, who's the co-convener of the Percent for Place Coalition and was instrumental in creating today's program. She's also there on the back end, making sure to address your questions. So thank you, Bridget. This conversation around civic infrastructure is resonating from Congress to local community groups and in the world of policy development. Today's program will start with a brief presentation by Sam Pressler. Sam is a civic infrastructure policy wonk and author of the Connective Policy Framework, a recent publication that takes a wide lens on the various ways civic and social infrastructure are critical for creating communal life and the role that policy plays in creating social connection. The presentation will be followed by moderated panel discussion, seeking to better understand through examples the role government practitioners can play in promoting and creating civic infrastructure. Joining our panel today are, and wave when I say your name, Anita Cozart. She's the director of the Office of Planning in Washington, D.C., where her work has included D.C.'s updated comprehensive plan and the Safe Streets for People program, among many others, working to activate public places. Her previous experience includes serving as the managing director of PolicyLink, implementing equitable development initiatives nationwide. Erica Pothig is the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Planning at the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago. Previously, Erica served as Special Assistant to the President for Housing and Urban Policy at the Domestic Policy Council. She is a researcher, policy leader, and an advocate for stronger communities. Kendall Smith serves as the Director of Policy Development and Legislative Affairs in the Office of Vermont Governor Phil Scott. In this role, she focuses on programs and policies that contribute to statewide community revitalization, including both physical and civic infrastructure. Finally, as our moderator for today's panel, I'd like to welcome Alexa Bush, Program Officer with Kresge Foundation's Detroit program. Alexa supports investments in transformative public spaces in the city of Detroit that promote greater understanding and inclusion, as well as strategies that advance the interconnections between sustainable urban development and economic equity. She's previously also a practitioner in this space, working for the City of Detroit's Planning Department. So thank you, Alexa, for leading this conversation today. Thank you to our panelists for being here. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sam Pressler for a brief opening presentation. Sam, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for for that introduction. I want to make sure my screen is getting shared. Looks like it's loading, which is fun. Here we are. Thank you so much, Kelly, and I'm really excited to be here. Sam Pressler, I'm the author of this connective tissue policy framework, which is really oriented around a big question. What's the role of government in strengthening connection in American communities? And I'm going to get into the policy framework, but I'm assuming most of you don't know who I am. So I just want to briefly introduce myself and kind of what brought me to this work, particularly around connection and community. And here I'll start with the middle of the slide. I think my formative experience of community was somewhat accidentally starting one. While I was in college, founded an organization called the Armed Services Arts Partnership, or ASAP, which is now the largest community arts organization in the country, serving veterans and their families. And it was through this experience of bringing an extremely diverse group of people together around some kind of shared purpose or shared interest, and over the course of a few weeks, seeing how people went from strangers to being willing to support one another unconditionally, that I kind of just had this like aha moment of the almost indescribable power of community and connection. And so as I handed that organization off, and I was trying to unpack what the heck just happened. How did I, as civilian, non-artist, become the head of the largest military arts organization in the country? I was very fortunate to do a fellowship at Harvard, and there I was kind of doing research, reflection, kind of spiritual reading. And that's where I kind of had this aha moment where I was like, oh, the thing underneath the thing is how do we connect, or how do we reconnect people to the communities, the commitments, and the connections that make our lives worth living? And it was really through that exploration that I found myself in conversations early last year with several policymakers who were starting to recognize that under the surface of a lot of the big problems in American life, whether it be kind of premature mortality and deaths of despair, whether it be economic immobility, whether it be democratic backsliding, was the weakening of our civic and our social lives. And these policymakers, like the Surgeon General here, like Senator Chris Murphy, were really motivated to take action. But the challenge is that social capital and social connection and these things have historically been fairly squishy, and it makes it pretty difficult to figure out how to sink your teeth into it. What could be the places where you begin? And that's where this policy framework came in. We really tried to build a organized, actionable starting point for policymakers to approach connection-focused policymaking. Thing that was really important was figuring out how do we like kind of tackle the breadth of this issue, because it could be everything, and make it accessible. And what we did was we organized it by 4 complementary chapters, one on foundational changes, one on community institutions, one on life transitions, and one on enabling conditions, each of which included 3 to 4 related sections. But then it was this kind of question of like, how do we make it actionable once we have this framework or this organization in place? And what we did there was we actually organized each section by the level of government or philanthropy that could take action, so federal to local and philanthropy. And then within each of those categories, we included specific policy opportunities that people can act upon, and then even complemented those with case studies or examples of what some of those policy opportunities look like in practice. And all told, we ended up with 150 plus policy opportunities across 4 chapters and 13 sections, including one on civic infrastructure, which we'll be talking about today. But I'll say, please, this is just going to be a very brief primer. I encourage you to check out the policy framework and dig into it more deeply. But thinking about civic infrastructure, I want to maybe tee up this part of the presentation, this broader conversation, in kind of thinking about civic infrastructure as the container that makes participation and relationship formation outside of home and work possible. And if we think about that, then we as policymakers, we as practitioners, also have an opportunity to strengthen and activate it to regenerate connection in our community. And that is going to be the frame, is how do we look at our civic infrastructure to regenerate connection? And to start, I would maybe an oversimplified definition of what makes a thriving civic infrastructure and a civic infrastructure that promotes connection. The 3 pieces here. First is accessible third places for community members to gather. So this is public places like parks and libraries and play spaces. It's civic spaces like community centers and town squares and downtowns. It's commercial places like cafes and bars and barbershops. But it's not just about those places. It's also about the groups and that host events. It's the programs, activities, events that encourage involvement, and it's the local leaders, facilitators, organizers who actually activate these spaces. But even activation alone isn't enough, right? Then we need to sustain participation. We need to sustain engagement. And it's through that sustained participation that we kind of build out like what I see as the virtuous cycle of participation community, where you have more accessible third places that generate higher participation lead to more relationships, and then more relationships as the referrals that come through relationships drive even higher rates of participation still. At the same time, through my research, through the interviews, the 80+ interviews I did to inform this framework, there were some gaps in how we think about civic infrastructure. And I want to point to two in particular. The first is that at times we can overemphasize the importance of the kind of physical third places and then underemphasize the importance of actually activating them. There was this kind of sense of, if we build it, they will come in some of the interviews and some of the research I did. But if we really want to create civic infrastructure that facilitates connection, we actually think about the activation of our third places as being built into the design, the operations of the civic infrastructure. The second piece I want to point to that's like quite important, and this actually emerged from a bunch of research, including a report I recently did with the Survey Center on American Life, is just how vast the differences are in access to civic opportunity by place, by class, and by race. And what you'll see here in the two charts to the right, the first is from the Survey Center on American Life report that I referenced, where we kind of see the educational difference in access to various forms of third places in communities and how much more people with college degrees tend to have access to both public, commercial, and civic spaces in their communities. The second piece is kind of the so what around it. It's showing the percentage, based on whether or not you have civic access in your community, how that relates to friendships in life. And what we see is that people with no access to these kind of civic spaces and these public spaces and civic opportunity, 32% report having no close friends, where in contrast, people with moderate access or extensive access, only 9% report having no close friends. So what I want to get into now and in teeing up our broader conversation is the potential role of policy here to strengthen our infrastructure to facilitate connection in communities. And this is going to be a very high level piece. Our panel is going to get much more into the detail, but there were kind of three areas that came about in the development of the policy framework that seemed quite important. The first is participation, and it's this idea that participation should be baked into all facets of a community's civic life. So that involves participatory governance, and there's a lot of different examples of what that looks like, from citizen and community assemblies to participatory commissions to just finding other outlets for residents to shape civic life, to more specifically participatory design processes and involving community members in the design of our third places, the design of the programming, the design of the governance and more, so that folks feel a sense of agency and the fact that these spaces and this programming is actually reflective of their needs. The second piece is funding, and this is somewhat of what Kelly was speaking to briefly, and I think we'll speak to a lot more in the panel, is how funding can play a role in the creation and the activation of this civic infrastructure. And here, pointing to the percent per place concept that was introduced, there is a role potentially for sticks and, when we have sticks and bricks infrastructure spending at the federal level, to potentially allocate some of that spending to build our local civic infrastructure, support our local civic infrastructure like libraries and parks, and also support the programming and activation that makes that happen. The other piece here is also not yet a policy or not yet fully manifested, but recognizing that the kind of decline of civic life in some places is somewhat a market failure akin to the market failure of local news, and recognizing that there may be a role for government or philanthropy to actually direct funds to strengthen the civic infrastructure in the places where it's struggling. The final piece I'll talk about is activation. And this is where we can, at all levels of government and philanthropy, provide resources and support to really bring the civic infrastructure to life. So first, something I've seen happening in communities across the country, I'm sure in many of your communities, is like these idea of microgrants. Like, how do we provide microgrants for neighbor-led programming, thinking about block parties, neighborhood barbecues or dinners, welcome activities, block improvement events that get neighbors interacting with one another in their kind of neighborhoods, in their third places, in their kind of civic infrastructure that builds that participation and sense of connection. The second piece is a bit more tactical and potentially raising the question, what's the role of personnel in all this? Should there be municipal and neighborhood level personnel who have the responsibility of doing everything from community engagement to planning to coordination to activation around the kind of strengthening civic infrastructure to facilitate connection, recognizing that this can be the work of ordinary citizens and neighbors, but also there can be support provided by government leaders. And so with that, that is the kind of preview of some of the opportunities for policy that we highlight in the framework and that we'll speak to more, but it's just scratching the surface. So I'm excited for the panel, and I'm excited to kind of for you all to dig into this further. Now, before I turn it over, I'll just say, if you want to get engaged further on the policy framework, feel free to read it at the website here that we'll also share in the chat. I encourage you to challenge it, build on it, take it further. This is a starting point and not an end point. And I said that like 10 times in it, and I really mean it. Share it with others who, whether they're policymakers, researchers, practitioners who you think might be interested in engaging with it. And please meet with me directly. I'm taking like 4 or 5 meetings a day, and it's just been so helpful to hear people's questions, hear people's feedback, and identify opportunities to collaborate and build on this work further. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Alexa and kick off this panel.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam, for giving that great introduction and really helping frame the importance of civic infrastructure. And now really excited to dig in with the panel on the various ways that government really at all levels can begin to support this. Some of this is probably happening. Some of this might be ways to scale, but really excited to be here and dive into these questions with you all. Again, we'll be taking questions throughout. We won't have a Q&A at the end, but please drop them in the Q&A box and we'll try and integrate those as we go. I do want to start with each of you to really move from this great framework that Sam laid out into some of the tangible examples of where this might already be happening. Of whether it's policy, whether it's programs, how you are working to strengthen civic infrastructure and social connection within communities at your level of government. Erica, would love to start with you both to speak to maybe some experience you've had also previously with the Biden administration, but would love to know about how you were thinking about that issue or framing that issue from a federal standpoint.
Thank you so much, Alexa, and what a pleasure to be on this panel, and thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. So as Alexa noted in the introduction noted, I was a member of the Domestic Policy Council in the White House up until about a year ago, working a lot on the infrastructure Build Back Better agenda. And a component of that agenda included a proposal that we worked deeply with folks on this call together and others in the development of something we call the Community Revitalization Fund. We can share a link to the background around that. But in the campaign, then candidate Biden, now President Biden, had proposed a $10 billion fund that we then defined in the following ways. And it really drew on all the lessons learned from the work of organizations on the ground, but the great research on the role that places and activating places can play in creating more social cohesion and opportunity for neighborhood residents. So the Community Revitalization Fund was proposed as a $10 billion fund that would fund community-led projects directly. Right now, a lot of the ways in which communities receive this money is through a political process at the state or the local level. And we proposed for the federal government to have a direct relationship and fund projects at a large scale. So this is, $30 to $50 million investments in projects that were really reflective of a community vision and included, in some cases, community development financial institutions, but also CDCs and other nonprofits that were developing these visions and seeking the kind of capital to implement them. But in those projects, these are physical projects, of course, but they would activate vacant land and buildings to create community amenities. We're going to talk a lot more about what kinds of amenities we know provide those third places, third spaces. But of course, conceptualized too was the fact that those spaces need operating support and long-term support. They're not just physical spaces, they have to be programmed. And so we conceived of having resources for the long-term programming of those spaces as well. But the idea is that their intention and their purpose was to strengthen social cohesion and build community wealth. So we imagine that these were resources that could include the establishment of community investment trusts that were a mechanism for creating community wealth and provide for intercultural and intergenerational mixing. We know from the research that positive intergenerational activity is a huge protector on crime, helps make sure babies are growing up healthy and strong, a whole set of related outcomes. This kind of positive activity shows up in third spaces, but it has to be supported. And then lastly, I would say one other vision for this fund concept and idea was to support new local economic activity and unlock private capital that so many communities have seen disinvestment over the decades, and we need to bring back that investment. And oftentimes the public sector is the first money in to create the conditions to bring private sector capital back.
Yeah, thanks, Erica, for sharing that. And I think too, even, the way you guys were thinking about that opportunity of not just the federal government participating directly, but really leveraging these other sectors, I think is really interesting too, to the kind of the movement we probably need to get this work done. Kendall, I would love to hand it over to you at the state level, just to talk about some of the things that are happening in Vermont to really push some of this forward.
Absolutely. Thank you as well for including me in this conversation today and representing Vermont. I just want to say very briefly, building off of Erica said, the way we've approached some of this work is recognizing those protective factors that those third spaces provide. And it is one of the most upstream prevention policies that we think there is that helps across the board in a number of ways that Erica talked about, whether it is avoiding interaction with the criminal justice system, preventing suicide, reducing isolation, strong kids. I agree so much with everything Erica just laid out. So when we take this concept and try to apply it to practice and programs here in Vermont, two that I will mention just kind of briefly is one program that's called Better Places. It's something that we worked on and proposed to our legislature in, I think it was 2021. And what it is it's a kind of community-led project-based program where we provide 2-to-1 matching funds. And what we ask communities to do are identify local projects that will contribute to their community revitalizations, whether it's parks, murals, farmers markets, things that will be community gathering spaces essentially, or help build community pride. And we ask them to essentially crowd grant for them. And we provide them local fundraising support, coaching, and then ultimately we do a 2-to-1 match with state funds. Since this was started, I think we have funded a little over 50 projects, and I'm happy to I think someone may put a link in the chat here to some of the resources if anyone wants to take a look at what we do with that program. There is a sustainability factor here where it's received one-time funding over the past few years, and so we need to refresh it and renew it almost every year with our legislature. I think it's an open question of if we create this as a base program or not. Another thing I'll mention, which is a little bit, I think different but related, is the way we've approached providing universal after school and summer program access, where that's not necessarily, sticks and bricks. Obviously there is a component, you have to have the space. But the way we have committed to progress on this issue started prior to the pandemic, and the impetus for Governor Scott wasn't necessarily the academic achievement component that many states have leveraged using their ARPA ESSER funds, but we came at it from that prevention lens and that social emotional development piece. And we talk a lot about it in terms of supporting kids find their purpose and their passion. And we've been able to create a dedicated state level funding source that we put into place, I believe, in 2020 with the existing federal funds. And we just, again, that piece about growing those relationships and providing those third spaces, thinking back to what Sam just went through in his PowerPoint for youth, I actually think coincides pretty nicely with this conversation and figuring out policy to practice. How can we apply this lens and leverage this lens in different ways?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kendall. Really great examples of kind of different spheres, different silos, how this work shows up, even though there's not yet maybe a department of like connection or a department of well-being, but how these layer across so many different silos. Anita, before digging in more on that question, would love to hand it over to you to really hear about this from your perspective in DC government, and just hear about maybe some of the programs and public space activations that you guys are exploring.
Sure, and thank you. I'm excited to be on this panel and be a part of this conversation. So I appreciate the invitation for it, and happy to talk about what we're working on here in the district. We really are investing in a few aspects of civic infrastructure, but I want to kind of focus on our work that's focused on the public realm, meaning our streets, our sidewalks, our parks, and our plazas. And that's really about lifting up culture, creating places of respite, and creating places that are inviting, gathering places for people to connect. So very much in line with some of the things that Sam was sharing. So last year, our mayor, DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, kicked off a $41 million infrastructure project at a major intersection in our city. And it's an intersection that's positioned between some of our busiest and fastest growing neighborhoods. And so we're using a road safety improvement project to create 3 new public parks. One of the signature parks is going to be Mamie Peanut Johnson Plaza. And that pays homage to the first woman to ever pitch in the Negro Leagues. And she was a longtime resident of the neighborhood and a youth sports advocate. And so we really, our work at the Office of Planning, I think that's a real important symbol of that, is because we advance our values as an inclusive and vibrant city as we plan for the growth and development. And that's through the lens of our neighborhoods. And we invite our residents to join with us and think about how planners and designers consider public space. And ways that we do that is by creating visual guides and taking residents on walking tours in neighborhoods to really think about what are the elements of our streets and our sidewalks and our plazas that make them welcoming, inclusive, create a sense of belonging. We also recognize that there are some of our neighborhoods have a lot of social capital, but they lack the financial capital to really activate public spaces and create that social connection. And so that means we don't get the benefit of celebrating all our cultures and all our histories. And so one of the things that we've done is through what we call Our City, Our Spaces project, we really provide resources for people to host gatherings and that kind of thing. And earlier this year, our public library system opened an equipment lending library. And so why this is important is because people can rent out at no cost AstroTurf, tents, folding chairs, tables, projectors, and all kinds of things that allow you to use our streets and our sidewalks for festivals and block parties and the like. Another piece that we're focused on is commemorative works. And for us, that is about visual art installations that tell our stories in our parks and our sidewalks and our plazas and our streets. These are symbols of our values and also our shared experience, right? They cultivate community pride. They remind us of the significant events, the significant people that have shaped the world we live in. I've got this backdrop here of Washington, and it's purposeful because DC is thought of as a place of city of monuments and memorials. And yes, we are. However, many of our commemorative works and our memorials, they honor people of national importance. But hey, we've got a story to tell as well, right? And also we understand that very few of the monuments and memorials really help us celebrate the contributions of Black Washingtonians and people of color. So to address this issue, we teamed up with community organizations to really collect input about the people, places, and events that we ought to honor to really broaden that story. We also hired urban designers and landscape architects to work with residents to really think about what is the experience that you want to have of this commemorative work as you're walking through the neighborhood, if you want to sit on a bench and enjoy it. And then we also partnered with our Commission on Arts and Humanities to bring artists in to really think about what is the featured work. And so we're excited. We've got these 4 great design concepts and looking forward to partnering to make them a reality. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, that's great. And I just love your point too. I think one of the first things you said was like, we were looking at the public realm and we like co-opted this road safety funding to really advance these outcomes, right? I think what a lot of you are talking about is, kind of working in these gray areas, right? Like I think this world of civic infrastructure we're talking about cuts across a lot of traditionally siloed organizations. You've got maybe like a library system and district with their own governance. You have the streets, you have community center, you have a park, right? All these are different silos, they're different funding streams. Just would love if, maybe we dig in a little bit about, what does partnership look in this work that you've done? How do you do it? And maybe even if there are some like lessons learned or pitfalls to avoid, just from what you've launched, would love to maybe dig in and kind of this funding stream partnership conversation. How do you start to put those things together? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in or I can call out some examples.
Happy just to start with that, Alexa, from speaking from the federal perspective. Some of what we've discussed today are very large infrastructure projects. And I think we, alluded to the fact that some of this conversation began with how to influence the bipartisan infrastructure law and get more of this kind of these third spaces contemplated in that vehicle. Did not quite 100% get there. But what I can say, when I was in the administration, there are ways in which you can help to prioritize the projects that do create these spaces, even if they aren't a special funding stream like reconnecting communities, right? Which is intended to address the ways in which infrastructure separated communities due to racial bias, in the past. How do we bring communities back together? And many of those ideas and plans created the kinds of third spaces, places that we're talking about, right? Through those kinds of investments. So there are examples like that where something gets into statute and then you can define what it means through the notice of funding availability and then prioritize the allocation of resources to the projects that meet those ambitions. And then there are additional ways in which you can take a general concept of road building, or I would say bridge building, or other kinds of transportation or other infrastructure projects. And then within that also conceive of how you can do funding criteria that do prioritize community engagement that we've referenced, and other ways in which you define what that looks like. You raise the bar for what it means to engage community and the definition of or prioritization of projects. And I would say one of the things I think the Harris administration has really tried to do is, where there's room and ability, to build in that those measures around raising requirements or expectations or points for pushing the envelope on more community engagement or building out third spaces, places. There was an attempt to do that, while not necessarily having the separate funding stream that says this funding stream is explicitly for supporting these kinds of places.
Yeah, those are great points of like the various levels at which we can advocate and think of the rulemaking to enable some of this to happen, or at least, yeah, if not explicitly call it out, leave the room to have that innovation at the local level. Kendall, and kind of that universal after school, I don't know, you mentioned sort of braiding together kind of state funding as a way to get more maybe durability of that source. Would love to hear how that went.
Sure, absolutely. So for after school and frankly, better places, and the approach we take with our administration, but also in Vermont generally, just historically, culturally, very local control state, and very much what is the will of the community, and using that as a starting point in terms of any project, any priorities, any initiatives. And that applies even to after school. So we have a mixed delivery system for after school, where with our state funds, we grant directly, not just to schools, but also to community-based organizations, nonprofit and private partners. They, of course, have to meet the grant application criteria of what they need to have for accessibility, for staffing, for programming, et cetera, et cetera. But we are able to be a little bit more flexible with our state funds. And then in addition, the federal source is 21C, which I assume at least some people on the call probably heard about. And so what we're able to do by being more flexible with those state funds is really go into those communities, especially those deserts that we have where we're still trying to expand having program and see what do you want? Like, how would it work best for your community? Should it be in the local library? Should it be through the municipal rec department? Should it be in the school? But then we do try to incentivize, and in a recent grant, it was requiring a partnership with the school leadership district supervisory union and that that third space or that community partner, just because very simplistically, where the kids are, right? In terms of engaging them in after school, before school, or summer programming. And so being able to braid those state funds, those federal funds, and then as Erica said, we've tried to be creative where, again, after school is prevention. So do we have prevention money that can be creatively applied under various buckets and seeing what other resources can be brought to the table. We also have very active partnerships with our local or our statewide rather after school association who is additionally bringing in private philanthropic money to help meet our expansion goals. So it's been really great to work on this effort and figure out from the community level first, what experiences do you want your youth to have? And then work with them on what that after school or that summer programming looks like, instead of being too prescriptive from the top down of this is what it must look like. Of course, we try to offer the best practices and help people advance and elevate and grow their programming, but trying to meet them where they are and then continue to build out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that outcomes focus you mentioned seems really powerful too, right? You're not just like, hey, we want this many seats, we want this many hours of programming, but you guys have been very intentional about like, yeah, if it's about prevention, let's track that down. That it sounds like those outcomes help maybe in organizing this work across, a lot of deciders, a lot of budgets, and a lot of people. That's maybe another great takeaway in this.
Yeah, it has. We have an interagency task force that meets on this regularly, and it includes the Agency of Transportation, the Agency of Natural Resources. You might think, why is your Agency of Natural Resources working on after school and summer programming? But they have conservation camps, one-day types events, our Agency of Commerce for youth employment opportunities and exploration, as well as a host of other, I won't go through the whole membership list, but unusual suspects that you might not think would traditionally be involved in working on after school and summer programming.
Yeah, that's a great point about finding those partners and not the standard places. Anita, I worked in a planning department. I feel like you've got kind of a superpower in the seat you sit in local government, even, and the ability to really look across probably what a lot of departments are doing. I wonder what that's looked like for you in DC or for others who really want to push on this idea of civic infrastructure, how planning might be a place that people can go to or team with to kind of understand where, the different programs and departments and money are and how to be effective in driving this change toward more civic infrastructure.
Yes, I would say, we have the benefit of here in the district being a state, a county, a city, all of that, right? And so we really have to, collaborating is just the name of the game. It really is. And so I have to say that my experience in talking with other agencies about this is that everybody is excited about the idea, excited about partnering and being there for all of the events and the unveilings and those kinds of things. And, partnering, whether it's the library system or Department of Transportation or our Parks Department, everybody's really enthusiastic about it. Part of it is like, we just have to get out of our own way. There may be some regulations that, oops, we didn't even realize that was a barrier. And so we just kind of work together to move things forward. If we've got to change things on the executive side or we need to work with council, we just work together to make that happen. In many ways, it's because the demand is there, and I think folks on this call who work at Main Streets, you hear what community members say about they want these places, right? And so it's really up to us in local government to deliver on that. That's kind of it, right? And, you know, also we live here, we enjoy them as well. And it's a great way to connect. And it's even a great way, as I said, you know, through our neighborhood tours and other things to demystify the work that we do. But it really does help that we're kind of in a place where, as the planning department, we think about data. We've got folks who are able to provide mapping resources and other kind of information that helps to drive some of these ideas and helps us track and evaluate the effectiveness of them, right? And helps us to be able to pivot and bring other ideas and other resources if in cases where we get stuck. I have to say also our main streets have been really receptive to this. I guess the only thing I would say is that it's a capacity issue. I think those that have got that capacity at the right time, they can jump right in there with us. Others have had to say, you know, we would love this idea and we're able to plug in one point, but maybe not for the entire thing. And certainly our business improvement districts similarly have been very enthusiastic about partnering with it. But it's really, it's been a great experience and we've learned some things about how we need to kind of improve our own processes along the way. But that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be this learning curve to get us where we need to go. Want to take a question from the Q&A, really about, you know, we've been talking a lot about the how of what we make and how to fund it and how to get there. This one is really about whether you guys have any successful examples or maybe things you've tried to create into programs that really address this issue of how does the civic infrastructure really start to build these connections and relationships across people of different backgrounds. I think, you know, Sam especially pointed out to this sorting, particularly by class, that I think we're seeing. Would love to know how you guys are thinking about that issue in either the programs you're designing or the policies you're looking to push for, to really take on this issue of kind of the mixing of people who are coming into this from really different backgrounds and experiences.
I can try to take that from the concept of what we've learned along the way in the development of mixed income communities. So taking us back a couple decades to, of course, William Julius Wilson's work on the declining significance of race, I think bore out this idea of creating more mixed income communities and the ways in which that class really matters in shaping that. And so in the redevelopment of public housing, first with Hope 6 and then later with Choice Neighborhoods, it was a policy to demolish buildings that were no longer habitable in some cases and redevelop communities as mixed income housing. And I would say in the beginning, many people were naive, and myself included in some of this early policy around, well, if we just put people together in the same building, that natural connection will unfold and create the kind of positive bridging connections and bridging capital that William Julius Wilson talks about in his work, being at the more neighborhood or community level. And I think with many examples early on, what people saw was we didn't think enough about how those communities were going to be governed and who had power in those communities and who set the rules for those communities. Because what happened early on was when they were created, well, the middle class or condo unit owners had the condo boards and they started to set the rules for the common spaces and whether the kids could ride their bikes or whether you could have your barbecue or, whether there would be furniture in the front opening, the front lobby area that people could hang out on. And what happened was some of that stuff got regulated in very unhelpful and discriminatory ways. And so the great work happening at the Center for Mixed Income Communities at Case Western around, when Mark Joseph is a leader of this work, really, how do we pay more attention to governance? How do we make those communities really work to bridge social capital and be positive examples of that and overcome some of the early days in history of if we just have this physical infrastructure, it will happen when in fact there's a lot of importance that we should attach to governance, programming, is a positive connection. And I think Mark's work, I would point people to it. There's just a history of evolution in that particular policy area.
Yeah, thanks for that, Erica. I think that's really important, is like the intention. It doesn't just happen, right? It probably looks different in different communities, but a real thoughtfulness to the governance and to the systems that need to actually support that feel really critical in this. Maybe Kendall, if I can jump over to you, really looking from the state perspective, we've got a question about like how civic infrastructure looks different, maybe from cities to more suburban to more rural places. Would love to know particular, maybe from those suburban and rural contexts, what does that look like from your purview at the state? How does it get activated, and what's the same and what's different?
Absolutely. I feel like I keep starting every answer I give with the word absolutely. So I'm sorry, you all. I don't know why I keep doing that. But I actually, one of the things you mentioned earlier, I think that we didn't quite address, or what are some of the barriers or the challenges. And being a very rural state, it can be difficult in terms of trying to promote civic infrastructure or community building projects in a way that truly bring people together, because we are so small and many of our communities are so spread out and remote. Where again, I know we're small compared to some of the other states on this call, like Louisiana or Illinois, and we can get, from the bottom to the top pretty quickly. But that being said, we're still small communities, very mountainous. And so transportation comes into play in terms of bringing people together really authentically, and all means all, like getting all people there, if that's what the goal is from a transportation perspective. We also run into a lot of barriers with our local municipal capacity. Our demographics in Vermont are not strong. We're an aging population, like many of the states in the Northeast. More older people with not the young pipeline coming up. And so we're seeing that play out in our municipal government infrastructure, where you have the same 20 people that are on the school board or the town clerk. We have, tree wardens. I won't explain what that is, but fill all of those roles. And they don't have time, frankly, to be trolling state government websites for grant opportunities or TA or support. And also don't have necessarily the capacity to do some of this community planning and community building work, where being able to go to a town and say, what are your top priorities? Figuring out a way to support communities coming together to identify those, and again, strengthen those bonds and those societal connections. It's a challenge for us right now. I'll be frank about it. I haven't cracked the code on that. So if there's anybody else from small rural aging states on this call and you have ideas, please drop them in the chat for me, because it's something we're struggling with really actively right now. How can we proactively take some of the burden off of some of the communities and some of the local municipal governments to support them, but without, dropping in, we're state government, here's what you need to do. There's a really strong organization in Vermont called the Vermont Council for Rural Development, VCRD, and they have a great community facilitation program where they drop into 1 or 2 communities a year and lead them through a process around identifying their priorities for their town. And a lot of those things are around these third spaces, and how are we going to meet community, public safety or healthcare needs, but what are we going to do with a derelict building? We really need a teen center. We really want to have a park, down by the river, and how to create an operational plan to get that work sustained and get it done. So I know that was a little bit of a different direction around challenges and barriers, but it's something that is very real right now for us in our work.
No, I mean, I think that's a really real piece of this, right? Is even though there might be a will and there's clearly a need, and I think we're seeing in spades, where and how to start to build that capacity or bring that capacity, or even partner thoughtfully to find that capacity is an important piece. It sounds like, especially in a rural context, but I imagine many even urban centers who might be facing economic distress or other challenges are probably struggling with some of that too. Maybe on that, I think there's probably a number of people on this call who are in positions where they can begin to like launch programs and policies. There's probably many of you who are more in an advocate seat, right? Like you want to figure out, how do I get this in my community? How do I work with local government to do this? Would love to maybe talk about with each of you, and maybe Anita, I'll start with you at the local level. For those who are maybe outside of government, how can they best advocate or partner, especially with a stretched municipal partner or otherwise, to begin to see some of this change? Or, what can they do to help facilitate government's role in this place?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways is just to, however you can do it, share what your vision is and share what it is that you're trying to do, and just to ask, do these resources exist? I think that's how many of the things that we shared in the chat came about, is because people said, yeah, that's nice, Anita, but we don't have XYZ. And so come back to the team. Can we create X, Y, and Z? Okay, we can't get to Z, but we can do X and Y. So let's do that. So I think that's definitely a part of it. What we've been trying to do is go to where people are, right? And so that's where we actually have heard the most about kind of the work that we're doing about public spaces, is to go where people are having a festival, or there's an event happening at a playground or a rec center or a library, and we hear about these things, and then we're able to think about, to what extent, what's our contribution to that? How can we bring others that we're connected to that? So I would say really just, share it in your own words about what's important, and ask us to be transparent about what we think we can deliver, and hold us to it.
Yeah, that's a great start. Yeah, Kendall, for you, as you were thinking in some of these neighborhoods, and even maybe through the grant process that you're starting to create, what's the best way to make it easy for you in a governor's office or with the legislature to make more of this happen?
So I would say know your audience and what their kind of priorities and strategic plan might look like. So for us right now, we're really focused, again, broadly on community revitalization, but kind of narrowing that down, affordability, public safety, education, and housing. I know that's very broad, but if you can come forward and make a pitch, right, about how this civic infrastructure or this place-based project is going to help in one of those 4 areas, and sometimes it can be creative or it can be long-term, that's going to spark, for example, our administration's attention a little bit more. If you can say, hey, I've done a little research. I know that this is what you all are focused on, and here's how what I want to bring to the table or work on with you can help in these ways, is going to at least get our attention faster. So again, know your audience, know what their core priorities are, and then think about how, again, your place-based initiative, the civic infrastructure, societal infrastructure work that you're doing can feed into those priorities.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And almost in some ways, the beauty of the breadth of civic infrastructure, right, and its multiple solutions probably gives you a key to that, of like, you could come at it from health, you could come at it from, economic revitalization. It's the same stuff at the end of the day, but how you tell that message really matters. Erica, knowing that you did a lot of advocacy and meeting with groups, if we want to see these ones get in the next bill, like what does that look like at the federal level?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. I'll do this from like two sides. One is, how do you influence the legislative process and think about ways you which get new ideas in, or some, make some of the existing funding streams, create room for more of this work in those existing funding streams. I hope that you're talking to your elected representatives and giving them ideas and connecting them up to national organizations like Main Street, and really helping to elevate the ways in which it would help your community, and giving them very specific places where existing funding streams could be amended. That's often easier to do, is to amend something versus create something whole cloth, because they may say, why can't you do it under CDBG, for instance? What's preventing you from doing that? So they may push you a bit on like why something new versus why amending something. So I would make sure you have your talking points clear on that and give good illustration to them. That would be huge, hugely important. I would then say, though, for existing funding streams like block grants, like the community development block grant, which comes to the state and the county and entitlement jurisdictions. So if you're a rural community, it's probably your county level or state level. If you're a larger urban area, it would be your city. There is a consolidated planning process that has a community engagement mechanism to it. A lot of communities do a peanut butter approach where they're spreading a small amounts of money to a lot of different things, and there is a mechanism for you to organize around informing how your local jurisdiction allocates those resources, because those are a lot of the activities we've described today are all eligible uses under the Community Development Block Grant Program. And so I would really hope people are looking for ways to engage in that. I would also say on the transportation side of the coin, there are different processes in different states for how projects get prioritized and elevated, but I would say your metropolitan planning organization is one place to engage because it has a mixture of locally elected officials at a regional level that are supposed to help plan and prioritize. I think, finding your way into lifting this up in their context. I saw a bunch of questions in the chat about integration of funding for the arts. Bring these issues to them. They are probably a better entree and voice to your state level, which is probably a little bit harder to get access to, but even through your state representatives, think about ways in which you look for ways to integrate some of these existing ideas into funding streams or the prioritization of projects that then get formula funds from the federal government or part of competitions that local and state jurisdictions submit to the federal government.
This is amazing. I feel like we could do a whole nother section just on that last piece of sort of like where are the different civic funding streams and how to tap them. But do you know we are running close to the end of time. So really appreciate the amazing information that you all have been sharing on this panel today. I know that there's a lot of like really tangible takeaways that I can imagine coming out of this. So thanks to everyone for participating, and maybe Sam and Kelly, I will hand it back over to you guys to close us out.
Awesome. That was, yeah, I have 2 pages worth of notes. That was incredibly substantive. So thank you all so much for your time and sharing your wisdom. I think, the call to action here is, at least what I heard, is there is a way that, the flexibility of doing this work around civic infrastructure and all the different entry points that you have, to your point, Alexa, if we're prioritizing kind of connection as a piece of our civic infrastructure advocacy, operations, implementation, there's actually really meaningful entry points to move this forward. So I just want to lift that up, check out the policy framework, check out all the resources that we'll share after. And I want to toss it to Kelly to bring us home.
Well, thanks so much, Sam. Thank you to Kendall, Erica, Alexa, Anita, everyone who's joined us today. I am doing a shameless plug for the Percent for Place Coalition in chat with just a little bit more information about our organization, our coalition. You'll receive follow-up, as Sam mentioned. We're going to try to pack everything in that we can in terms of the links that were shared and the highlights of this discussion into a follow-up email to you. So thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, so much to our panelists for taking the time out of the work of getting this done on the ground and in policy to be here with us and focus on this for what was an hour that felt like it could go on for so much longer. So we appreciate your time so much, and we appreciate the opportunity to continue this conversation in the future with everyone. So I will close out us for today with, again, thanks. I can't say it enough. And we'll see you in a follow-up email. Thank you.